Es nezinu, redzēt labāko ralliju vai labāko koncertu, brauc uz Somiju. Grib redzēt labāko kontroli, tad dedzināšanu, brauc uz Somiju. Labāko parku infrastruktūru, brauc uz Somiju. Šeit laikam nav izņēmums. Tanī brīdī, kad mums vajag kaut kādas labas piemēras pasmelties, mēs saucam cilvēks no Somijas. Mr. Stig Johansson, jā, paldies, jā, un vārds viņam no parka Metsähallitus struktūra vienības Park and Wildlife, jā.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I think this is a really important meeting and conference, as we already heard, especially as we are moving towards the post-2020 framework, as Alda was mentioning. Also, I have to take the opportunity to thank Latvia for this fantastic Europark conference that we had in September last year. It was really great, a great event with lots of positive feedback from everybody. Anyway, I was very, very impressed by the previous speaker, Alda. I think you took most of my words in much fewer slides in a better way than I will do. But anyway, I will try to do something. Okay, my name is Stig Johansen. I'm currently the Director of International Affairs at Parks and Wildlife. But I used to work, or I had the opportunity to work at the World Bank between 2012 and 2017. And I was involved in drafting the biodiversity roadmap for the World Bank, and then finally 2.5 years working with WAVES, which I will be talking about, which is about ecosystem services and valuation. Okay. No, not yet there. Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is what I will talk about a little bit, but I have to remind you that I'm not speaking for the World Bank. This is about the World Bank and the World Bank project, because I'm not there anymore, so it's a disclaimer. I'm not from the World Bank anymore. Anyway, the background for WAVES and natural capital accounting is in the efforts to get better tools to measure progress and well-being. It's also a concern that nature, ecosystems, and ecosystem services are not properly reflected in the decision-making frameworks, in the policy frameworks, as we actually heard by the previous speaker. And with the words of Joe Stiglitz, who used to be the World Bank economist, Nobel laureate, which I had the pleasure to listen to several times at the bank, you can't manage what you don't measure. And what we measure really affects what we do. This is what he's saying, and this goes back to the Stiglitz Fitoussi report already before 2010. Nature and biodiversity ecosystems, they are really underpin and they are the foundation for development. They're also the foundation for the sustainable development goals. After all, what we've achieved in terms of development is much because of use and extraction of natural resources. So it's an important issue. But before I move on, a couple of words about the economic space WAVES is operating in still, even if I'm not there. At the bank, WAVES was always placed within the context of economic decision-making, in the economic context, in the context of total wealth. So it's just one element. And really, it emerged as a tool for better decision-making, and that's what we were trying to push also at the bank. It's also an effort to place sort of the sector, the environment sector, a little bit more from an ad hoc sector to a real sector with proper, consistent statistics and information. And WAVES, what was important with WAVES is that a very explicit and systemic policy focus of the work. So we worked with ministries of finance and development in most countries. It was initiated in 2010 actually at the COP in Nagoya. It's a World Bank-led partnership to mainstream natural capital in policy development, planning and decision-making. Specifically, the purpose was to implement and use policy-relevant accounts and contribute to development of ecosystem accounting, also for training, capacity building, knowledge sharing, and then build international consensus on natural capital accounting. From 2017, I left mid-2017, the WAVES program has morphed into the bank program, the Global Program for Sustainability, GPS. And GPS has 3 pillars, basically connecting WAVES to efforts to develop global metrics on sustainability and financial incentives. So the pillar 1 works on information base and tools for policy to inform policy and investment. The second pillar is WAVES, which I'm going to talk about, is helping countries to build capacity. And pillar 3 is about integrating sustainability in the functioning of financial markets. So that's basically what the bank is normally doing. And we worked GPS and WAVES with a number of countries. The countries which you see here are the countries WAVES is working with at the moment. We had lots of partners, both from Europe and elsewhere in the world. So how can natural capital accounting assist in countries to manage what they do? Actually, we've heard many examples already today about what it can do. Help by monitoring and providing consistent data. I think the issue of consistent data and statistics is really, really important and long-term in this case, and which can be used to develop functions and scenarios and projections for the future, and ultimately feed into policy and decision-making at the sectoral and national level, which is really what was called for here also earlier. And it's a way to break down different silos and to see the information in a better way, and in a way which allows to see the sector and the sector's impact in across the whole economy. So that's what is really helpful for. But we also need to speak and reach out, as we heard, much more to financial institutions, development institutions, other sectors that influence environment in our countries. Well, then a couple of short cases. This will be very brief issues. One is from a catchment management project for hydropower from Himachal Pradesh in India, where the question was about targeting soil conservation, to get information to introduce payment for ecosystem services in Himachal Pradesh, and to be able to target better the management interventions in forested watersheds. So, you know, this you can transpose to any other situation as well. The second thing was to test different models for prioritizing investments. Comparing materials for linking management to water yield and sedimentation, to provide a framework for valuation and assessing the ecosystem contribution to the hydro sector, and testing models like RIOS Invest and SWOT. Those are models. 2 first models are developed by the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University, and the third, the SWOT, is a model by the US Department of Agriculture. Well, these are prioritization tools and targeting tools. At Parks and Wildlife, we use zonation a lot in a similar way to prioritize our actions. Well, just some results from the work, and I think the most important issue is again about testing and seeing how it works. It works well, for instance, for targeting and prioritizing payment for ecosystem services, but it all depends on different models, and the question is often also about capacity. So like the best models, like the US Department of Agriculture's SWOT model, is the best for the purposes that we had there, but the ability to use it, the lack of data, the lack of capacity to use the model are limiting factors. So these are also things one has to consider when you work on ecosystems and ecosystem accounting. So the challenge is availability of high quality and locally vetted data is really critical. Often global and other data sets are not really accepted by local and national decision makers. And then understanding data availability and sharing, this is also not clear in most countries. Even here, it's an issue. So open data and public data, how that is shared and used is an issue. And then connecting different capacities, modeling capacities, that could be, in this case it was GIS, but it can be also about economic modeling, ecosystem modeling. In general, different skill sets across the government. And then the most important is really connecting to decision makers with the data and the scenarios that you have developed. So the connection to decision making is really critical. The second thing is, or second case is actually two from Philippines. One is from Lake Laguna in Metro Manila area, where they now have the volcano eruption, often affected also by tornadoes and flooding. So there in Manila, the question was about flood risk and the changes, about the water quality and how this affects fisheries in the area, and then changes in the watersheds, the forest cover. In southern Palawan, which is the one to the left, I think, marked to the left, it was about economic development. It's a tourist area, a very nice tourist area. So what kind of economic development is compatible with maintaining natural resources, which are the base for tourism again, and how to improve and use land use planning as a tool in economic planning and development planning, and then what kind of changes and impacts will development have on biodiversity, including coastal resources. So what were the findings there? Of course, not revolutionary in any way. What we found, of course, is the number of people have increased in the Manila area, and it was really urgent to get land use planning in place. There was clearly a base for introducing fees for aquaculture in the area. So this has direct linkages to the economy. And the fact that the sedimentation affects flood control, and flood control and flood issues are really high-cost issues in Philippines. In Palawan, again, there were plans for oil palm plantations. But what was found out by the study, there was far too little water for oil palm plantations. There was also already a problem with the growing rice in the area because there was too little water. And the fact that you need to preserve the forest was really important, both for water yield as well as for the planned domestic water systems in the area. So for retaining forest cover was really critical. Again, what we found out that the ecosystem accounts, which actually adds an element which is not normally in accounting, it adds the spatial element. And that's a very useful tool at local and national level planning. And you really need to use that, but it's rarely possible with the resources and the capacities you have at the local level. You normally need to engage a broad set of skill sets in the national level, and sometimes international experts. It takes many years sometimes to do the whole thing, and it requires real strong government ownership, and that normally means there has to be a policy demand for that. Communication is extremely important, as you mentioned, also for the project, and the question of cost effectiveness in work is critical if you want to scale up these type of efforts. Now, WAVES was also working on a lot of tools and testing and analytics, and this is an issue about the valuation of mangroves and coral reefs in coastal protection. That was also based on work in the Philippines. It was looking at the role of natural solutions as an alternative to grey infrastructure. I was happy you mentioned this actually in your talk also. And develop the valuation of reef and mangroves in managing, protecting the coast. And what was important here is that we actually used, or they who worked on the project, used the insurance sector valuation methodologies. Because it's often better to use the sector which you're trying to influence, use their tools and methodologies to make your case. If you present something new, it's most often, unfortunately, rejected. So then about WAVES as a program. Our program was trying to institutionalize and sort of making a systemic impact in the countries we worked with. And there are a couple of things which came out of that. The first is that it's important to develop NCA, natural capital accounting experience and capacity by using the SIA central framework accounts, forest accounts, water accounts, mineral accounts and such, in some sectors which are really of high economic importance in countries. So that is really looking at the environmental accounts as a way to expand the national accounts, which again produce most of the important indicators for economic planning. And then look at some of the sectors really which are important and link that to the economics in the country. The second thing was to expose. SIA became a standard, environmental accounts and the central framework became standard in 2012. Ecosystem accounts are just experimental still. They might become a standard in a couple of years. That's the latest information I have. So, you know, you have to work with that and develop that capacity, but a much more strategic engagement, and I think with the aim to institutionalize it if possible. Then what we need in all kinds of valuation work is to link it much more closely to macroeconomic frameworks. That could be integration into the national accounts and sector indicators. That could be SDG monitoring, OECD accession issues, green growth indicators and such. And what is really critical is outlining how your information, data, accounts will be used by policy makers and have a policy impact. That doesn't come by itself. You really have to figure out how to best do it. Now, how to achieve a policy impact was the most important thing, because there was a strong policy focus with WAVES. So it's really important to identify the necessary steps and analytics required to translate the structured statistics, which the accounts are, into information that can be used by decision makers. Second, it's really important if you're starting this type of work to identify the policy issues and entry points and what information is required and at what phase in the policy cycle the accounts or the information analytics might serve. And the third thing is really identifying the institutions which do the analytics work, because they are often different from the sectoral data providers, the often statistical services which combine or do the accounts, and then there are separate people, institutions doing the policy work, policy analytics, serving decision makers. So that's different skill sets, and you need to engage them from the very beginning. Then some lessons. I think we were quite successful in institutionalizing and getting a national NCA dialogue going, and also developing a range of accounts, but it takes a long time. It takes much longer time than anticipated. And you need to, especially if you go for an institutionalized systemic approach, it requires real readiness. You have to have data, sufficient data, capacity, people, institutions who can work with it. And there needs to be a willingness to work with it. You need to be better at identifying policy entry points for your, otherwise the data is something that you have produced either as an academic institution or a conservation institution, but it really only serves your own purpose and not really the broader economic or development context. In waves, we often work with the accounts first and then with the policy analytics and then with decision making. I think what we found out that you really need to start working all of these things at the same time. So when you start working on the data and the accounts, you really need to identify, engage the analytics, because it also determines which information and data is most important, because oftentimes you don't have all the data you require for producing the information and the accounts. And then, of course, which is natural, use the existing information, data coordination mechanisms and frameworks that you have in place in countries. In many countries, we could also see that there was a demand for accounts, there was a demand for the information, but it was not properly managed so that the information was there in time for the decision making. Decision making will always happen, whether you have the data or not. So it's better to have the data before the decision is made than 2 years after it has already been made. So managing these things to make it in time is very important. And then I can't emphasize enough the immediate links to the macroeconomic frameworks, indicators, economic and development frameworks. If you don't do that, it also stays as your own very useful information, but not useful for the society. So what's the purpose of accounts? It's also important. You really need to think what the issues you are trying to address. Is it national? Do you create a national system like the national accounts with environmental accounts? Is it local, short-term, long-term issue? Do you go for systemic development? The spatial dimension I already mentioned. It's something which is very useful, and we've seen already in the presentation by Inga in the beginning. And then look at the national priorities. There are some examples. Water in Botswana, Colombia, for instance. Land accounts in Rwanda. Mineral accounts in Philippines, and so on and so forth. Some countries, like Costa Rica and Colombia, had the OECD accession going. So that also raised the interest from their side. And then better use the opportunities with the national accounts, for instance, national balance sheets and consistent data. Always emphasize the consistent data and statistics for analytics that we generate. So I think natural capital accounts are really good tools to inform decisions and trade-offs. The trade-offs were already also mentioned here by the wastewater and the biotopes. I think there were too many expectations on natural capital accounts in 2010 when all this started rolling again in a serious way. I think it's not the solution, but it certainly can be a contribution and an effective systemic contribution. Thank you.